He helped with our website. The American website before our time. And then he moved to Amsterdam. And he now runs an NGO that promote entrepreneurship in Portuguese-speaking African countries.
He was a member, I remember.
Very, very interesting. Having the lunch together. You got a scarf.
And do you think okay. Mónica Santiago.
How are you? Easy.
Good afternoon to all of us, and welcome to this is the first session of the new series of conferences dedicated to the next presidential elections in the United States that, as you know, will take place in November, and that FLAD decided to organize. The idea is and will be for the next month to invite a group of American stakeholders, political or educational or social important stakeholders, to hear from them their analysis on the American internal situation, as well as the prospects for the foreign policy that we are all expecting, and some of us concerned about it. For the first session, we invited Professor Jan Lesser. He's a distinguished fellow and an advisor to the president of the German Marshall Funds, as well as the head of the German Marshall Funds position in Brussels. And not just for this session, but for this group, for this series of conferences, that means for the next 3 to 4 months, we invited Márcia Rodrigues, that we really wanted to have the possibility to interact with her due to her specialization and well-known knowledge about the international positions and factors, as well as in particular the United States situation. So with Márcia we are engaging RTP in this series of conferences, and Márcia will be the person that with us will help to engage in what I think will be very enlightening conversations about this international situation. I will not go any longer about the importance of next American presidential elections. I think it's clear for all of us the impacts that the foreign policy that will be the official position of the United States concerning foreign relations, and aware of the prepositions, let's say, that we heard from the two candidates, and that we have perfect conscience that will impact on us the result of that election, and for certain it will impact on the life and initiatives of FLAD concerning the United States and the relation between Portugal, and not only Portugal but Europe, and the United States. So we see it as the continuity of our mission being to help to improve the knowledge between Portugal and the United States, and the United States and Portugal, that we think this cooperation can act, first of all, promoting the knowledge of each part, but also through people and relationships. So, like in the past, we believe seriously that it's through people and relationships that, first of all, these matters can be improved and sustained. So, as well as the first intention of an opportunity for all of us to reflect on the United States position and reality before and after the next elections, we also see it as a moment for the ones between us that are students, professors, investigators, researchers, somehow connected with this matter, to first have the point of view of someone outside Portugal about these matters, and in second place to interact with the other Portuguese players that we can find in this room. So this will be a session, not a conference. So after the speech, let's say, in the first moment, there will be a second moment that Márcia will help us to put in place, to start a second moment of questions and answers. So please feel free to put your questions and interact somehow with Professor unless I seriously think that it's an opportunity for each of us to learn a little bit and to have a more real contact with what's the reality in the United States in this moment, not the preconcepts that we can have, but reality that is in stake from someone who has been involved in studying these matters for a long time. So, as I begin, that will be as I finish. Thank you all for coming, and especially Márcia. Thank you
so
for having accepted our invitation. And Márcia and Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mr. President. So, hello everybody. I'm very pleased to talk with Dr. Jan Lesser. So let's go, right? Here, American elections, there is not, according to the polls, a clear winner. Not yet. We cannot perceive that yet. So how crucial is this outcome of these elections for the transatlantic relationship?
Well, the short answer is it's very important. And first of all, let me also say how nice it is to be back in this house, because I spent some time here a number of years ago as a fellow, and it was a wonderful experience, and I've been back many times since, and it's really nice to have this conversation. So thank you for the invitation. It's usually important. I mean, above all, it's usually important for the American people. And you know, what I say is just these are my personal views. I mean, GMF is a nonpartisan institution, but we have our own views. I mean, it's usually important. You know, the stresses in the society, we'll talk more about this, all kinds of public policy challenges domestically, but when it comes to foreign policy, I mean, obviously, there are global stakeholders in this outcome, not least in Europe, because the relationship across the Atlantic, you know, remains the biggest, most important in economic and diplomatic and security terms globally. So, you know, what happens, what U.S. policy is like, the style of an American administration makes a big difference. You know, we've run different experiments on this in recent years. You've had different experiences with different administrations. It matters. Everybody watches it.
You were in Brussels.
Yes.
So you can feel how anxious Europeans are, right?
I can.
In NATO, in the EU, so it's a great city to feel that.
It is.
What kind of degree is that one?
Well,
They are really anxious with options, shall we say. There are only two outcomes, Harris and Trump. I'm of course talking about anxiosity due to the possibility of Donald Trump become, again, US president.
yeah, I mean, it's interesting to be an American. I've been in Brussels for 13 years, and you know, our mission at GMF is to strengthen transatlantic cooperation, so we spend a lot of time on different issues, but a lot of it is on this sort of straight-ahead future of transatlantic relations questions. There's a lot of anxiety. I think it's driven by a lot of different things, partly by experience of recent American politics and what it's meant for Europe, but also in part by what is happening in the world. I mean, this is a much more dangerous time to ask this question about the outcome. There's a war in Europe. We have this mounting competition, challenge with China. The list goes on. There's crises in the Middle East. I know we'll talk about some of these things, but also, you know, very substantial domestic challenges, and that's obvious in the campaign. So, you know, there's a lot in that score. I mean, there's no question that Europe would like to have predictability from the United States, and in recent years, predictability has been, you know, in somewhat short supply. Not so much because this administration, the Biden administration, which has in fact been extremely Atlanticist. And, you know, I know there are people in the audience who spent their life part of it on this, and you know, I'm extremely supportive of the last years in the relationship. Not least because sitting in Brussels, it's been very striking to me how EU-centric, in some ways, American policy has been. I mean, I think the Biden administration was, you know, even compared to some of its Democratic predecessors, notably focused on the European Union as an interlocutor on key issues. And not just on issues where it's unavoidable, like trade, but also on other things, on sanctions and export controls and lots of different regulatory issues. That hasn't always been the case. It certainly wasn't the case with the Trump administration. It wasn't always the case with the Obama administration or its predecessors. So, you know, when you look at this from Washington, and I'm not even mentioning the NATO piece of this,
We'll go
which is
there.
obvious. We'll go there.
We'll go there.
You know, this is a critical thing, and yeah, I'd say it's a time of rather high anxiety in Brussels about the outcome.
So, Ms. Harris-Kenwin, do you expect, if she is the next president of the US, the continuation of the Biden foreign affairs doctrine concerning multilateralism, great commitment to the support of the allies, to NATO, and to the support of Ukraine? Do you think she will follow that path?
Well, I mean, presidents bring their own personality and they bring their own preferences. So, you know, nothing is pure continuity. But, you know, in general, I would say, yes, it's probably a story about continuity. But, you know, continuity doesn't always survive events in the world. Things can happen which will present any administration with new challenges, and you don't know exactly what's going to come out of that when it seems from Brussels. So, but in general, I would say she's been part of this administration, she's been part of these debates. You could expect, you know, continuity. The people around her who advise her have been part of this. They're very much in the U.S. foreign policy mainstream, I would say. Very Atlanticist, actually, in their formation. So that argues for continuity, I would say. But it's also, you know, what are you judging it against? I mean, arguably, President Biden is the most foreign policy oriented American president since the elder Bush, maybe, in terms of his experience and his engagement and knowledge of people, especially in Europe.
As you
That's a
used to
high
say, I know
standard.
everybody since Luso-Americana.
It's a high standard, you know, and so, and the world keeps changing, and it's becoming more uncertain. So, you know, yes, continuity by virtue of people, by virtue of philosophy, etc.
Even,
Sure.
Dr. Lesser, in the issue of the Middle East,
Hmm.
because Ms. Harris tries to have a different approach, or at least to show a different approach. We saw that in the last trip that Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, made to Washington, D.C., and on the press conference moment, she never smiles. This is not Vice President Harris. She's a very smiley person. She was serious. The body language was quite distant from the Prime Minister of Israel. So there was a difference in here. But do you believe that that will be just optics? But the main issue of the commitment to the defense of Israel will continue?
My view is that the commitment to Israel's defense is very strong. Not just defense, but a whole set of relationships with Israel. And I think it's widely shared in the American political system, actually, and in the society. I mean, that said, there are big differences in policy. And multiple administrations have had big differences in policy with Netanyahu. I mean, not too many American presidents were smiling in press conferences with Netanyahu, if I can say. And so, you know, he's difficult and under extremely difficult conditions now. So, you know, do I expect a revolution in relations with Netanyahu? I wouldn't expect a revolution.
It's just another episode of a long history of friction.
I do think, and here I'm speculating. I mean, I do think, you know, someone who comes at this not having spent much of their career in foreign policy, you know, as Biden had, you know, it brings a different perspective. As, in fact, Obama had a different perspective on a lot of foreign policy issues. It was a bit distrustful sometimes of the foreign policy orthodoxy. He was very explicit about this, in fact. So, you know, again, there's no such thing as pure continuity in these things. I think a Harris administration, or for that matter, a Trump administration, would be dealing with an environment, political and in the society in the United States, that is basically very supportive of Israel. They may or may not be supportive of specific policies,
But
Gaza or other things, but in general,
the commitment.
the commitment I think is very broadly shared in different communities for different reasons, actually.
And that probably
and,
will continue with,
you know,
with Harris and Trump.
I would imagine.
In spite that Donald Trump was a great friend of Netanyahu.
Until he wasn't.
In the end, he became an enemy of Netanyahu, so we don't know what will happen now. But that's about personality.
It's a tradition.
So, if Donald Trump wins this election, multilateralism, support for the allies, maintaining NATO as it is, and support for Ukraine, will all of this be at stake? Or or not?
Well, it is all at stake. I mean, it's always at stake when you have these kinds of big political changes. But will he actually shake up all of that? I doubt it, if he were to be elected. You know, there's a kind of hierarchy of change, I could imagine. I don't believe he's taking the United States out of NATO. There are things, of course, you can do short of that, which would be very, very disruptive.
Charles de Gaulle in
you
66?
yeah, you could. I think that even would be a little extreme.
Too
You
much?
could draw the United States from the integrated military command or something like this. I think that it's almost unthinkable, not least because there is still a very strong body of support for NATO in the alliance and even in the bipartisan strategic community. Could a Trump administration make life in NATO very difficult? Absolutely. I mean, we're not an easy partner necessarily, and you know, it could get rougher. But I don't see him getting out of NATO or anything like it. Just bringing strong messages about burden sharing, very sharp things, making lots of things conditional and transactional. Sure, yeah, we saw that. But I don't see him getting out of NATO or anything like that. On the other hand, when it comes to the European Union, here, I think there is very little taste for seeing the EU as a key interlocutor on a whole set of issues, which would be really a departure. And then on a whole set of things like climate policy and green transitions and so on, we could go into this. You know, the administration obviously would have very different views, and a real departure from European preferences, but not everywhere in Europe. There are places in Europe where, you know, a Trump administration might be welcome.
So his approach probably will be more bilateral than with the bloc.
I would go even further and say
He's
that
not,
his
he's
approach.
not a fan of the European Union.
No,
so-
he's not a fan of the European.
So it
But I
might
would
be-
say I would go even further and say that his worldview, as near as I can understand it, is driven surely not by institutions, well, yeah, by state-to-state relationships, but above all by individuals, by leaderships, positively or negatively. You know, people he likes, people he doesn't like. I mean, that's always part of the equation with world leaders, but I think he takes it a step further.
He always had particular confessed admiration for President Vladimir Putin, even before he was a candidate to the US presidency. Here's what he said lately. He would encourage Russia to do whatever the hell it wanted to the European countries that didn't spend more on defense. When we listened, he also said that he would cut immediately the support to Ukraine. He never said that he wanted victory against Russia. He says that the settlement has to be done immediately. Is this a bit more than just Trump talking
Look,
and
I
saying
mean,
all those extreme
what he said,
things that he says? This,
I would hope not, but you know, you never know. I don't want to run this experiment necessarily myself, but this is my personal view. I think there is still, as we saw in this debate, which was very contentious and too drawn out, obviously, about the renewal of funding of support for military support for Ukraine that we saw some months ago. I mean, that did enormous damage, but in the end, it got done, and it got done because there was still a sentiment in Congress, a bipartisan one, to do it.
6 months after.
Yeah, it was terrible. It was
6
terrible.
months after.
But you know, he's so mercurial that I hesitate to predict exactly what he would do. I mean, do the odds on continued support for Ukraine go down with him? Of course they do.
You really said, and this is important, that according to John Bolton, right, he really said that he wanted to leave NATO while he was president. And there was, in a summit, a terrible moment where he got in the room, then he left, and then he went back again. And there are more than 12 or 13 witnesses that spoke to the international press in a deep investigation that said he announced to his people that that day he was leaving NATO. So this is a bit scary. It happened already. But he doesn't trust in
But he didn't do
tradition.
it, and he was stopped from doing it. And
He doesn't trust in traditional alliances. He doesn't trust in institutions. of powers such as UN. It doesn't trust, in a way, on the bedrock of the international order made by the US after the Second World War. So, how can he make America great in the international scene?
I don't think he asks himself the questions the way you just put them. I don't. I think he asks what's in it for him. And by extension, perhaps, let's give him the credit, what's in it for us? What's in it for, what's in it? In a very transactional way. And I think when you ask that question about NATO, the answer will be, well, on the balance, it's still something that matters for us. And there will be people in the Senate who will reinforce that view. But a lot will depend on who is appointed.
Yeah, right.
That's another conversation about the last time, perhaps arguably, he didn't expect to be elected. And there was no pipeline of people, as there tends to be in the American system. These appointees matter. So they came from all over, and some were moderate and some were less so. There happened to have been, in fact, an ambassador at NATO who was relatively moderate and helped in this regard. Would that be the case the next time around if he were to be elected? I don't know. Now there are people who've been angling for these roles. They have sharper policy views. It's quite. I don't know whether that makes it more unpredictable or less.
So he might, this moment we really don't know, be again the leader of the biggest democracy of the free world.
Well, India is.
Powerful democracy, you're right, yes, India is bigger,
Oh.
you're right. But the most powerful democracy of the free world. And he has this fascination for dictators. Some people call them autocrats, but we can call them dictators, such as Putin. Not as much as Xi. So this alliance between Russia and China, this partnership, the Chinese don't call it alliance, they call it partnership with no limits. He likes one of them, but he dislikes the other. What's the rationale?
He has, I can't explain his thinking about this. Clearly he has an extremely hawkish view on China.
Yes.
Largely driven by economic perceptions, not necessarily by security so much. That tough view on China is one of the very few things Republicans and Democrats actually agree on now in Washington. So in some sense, that view is broadly shared. He's kind of in the mainstream. Where he's less in the mainstream is a very, very aggressive approach on tariffs and other things like that. And so, I think it's this unpredictability that you have to reckon with, and not just in terms of policy in a kind of linear sense, but what happens when you have a serious crisis? The quality of decision making, people around the president, how does that work? And there you have to consider what that would be like. Do you want, you can imagine very different dynamics in a kind of Cuban Missile Crisis like scenario, and you can imagine things like that, depending upon who is in the White House.
Right. And depending on the moment.
And depending on the,
He was also the president that, in spite of the pressure, refused to attack Iran. He said, well, there are 23 men in that military base that is one of our targets. I won't do it. I'm not going to be the West president that is going to attack Iran. And that was not usual because he didn't like the Iranians. He was a great ally by then of Israel,
right.
Still is. Not so much of Netanyahu now, but you really didn't do it. So
I think,
it depends of the person and of the moment.
It may. Also, he is, I think, much less comfortable in the world of sort of conventional foreign policy and security policy and issues of military practice and all of this. He's much less comfortable in that world than he is in the world of trade and commerce. And even that, though, I have to say, one of the things that was very noticeable in Brussels when he was in office was this attempt to kind of decode him as a political leader, right, and try to understand how it is that you would relate to him. And it was very difficult to do. But one of the views was, well, he's a businessman, and how does he view the world based on that? And perhaps there's some way that we can interact with him in that mode. But the truth is, and actually I grew up in New York when his sort of heyday of his family's real estate empire. And the truth is that business in New York is not, it's kind of sui generis. It's not like other businesses where you maintain long-term relationships and you build brands and and all this kind of, it's about cash flow and all. It's different. They go from one deal to another. The deal works or it doesn't work, and then on to the next one. And that, I think, has shaped his...
That's his home.
That's kind of his home. That and the fact that even going back to his family's experience in the real estate business in New York, he probably hasn't spent a day in his life without being in court.
Right.
Seriously, either being sued by somebody or suing them, or it's in some ways the nature of that business. But they were particularly aggressive, rather moderate practitioners of that in that sector. And I think these things, you have to sort of think about that a bit, But when it comes to issues of military strategy and arms control and things like this that other presidents had a real taste for, I don't think that's his thing. So who gets appointed in these roles to advise him really, really would matter.
Yeah, it was one of the main stories in the beginning of his presidency, as you know, is that he has a briefing, namely with the CIA, and he said, I don't want to read anything, right? You just tell me, okay? Make it fast. He didn't want, right? So those matters actually are not so, he's not so interested in
We've had other
that.
presidents who did that too.
So he says he will not support Ukraine any longer. He wants the war to stop immediately. He wants a settlement. So are the Europeans ready to support Ukraine without US and to defend themselves from Russia without US? In less than 50 years.
People have done recent studies about this. I mean, Europe collectively has done as much as the United States, if you want to measure it in terms of dollar value of military contributions. But that only tells you part of the story, because part of that is, frankly, about the combination of the United States and Europe. You need both. Ukraine needs both. We need both if we think it's in our interest. If you only have one, it's simply not going to work, I think. And if the U.S., this plays in a very funny way in the United States, because Europe does more, the political critics say, well, Europe is obviously doing it, so what do they need us for? If Europe does less, they say, well, they're failing on burden sharing, why should we support them? So this is a very difficult thing to square unless you are convinced, as I think we should be, that it's in our strategic interest, regardless of what the other does. It's in our strategic interest to support them, because if they lose, it's going to pull on a string that we don't want to pull on. And so
the credibility of
our
the
credibility
U.S. deterrence
and the role of Russian power in Europe, the
diminish.
whole thing. And so I think, to your question, Europe can obviously do a lot if it's a matter of supporting Ukraine in terms of money and funding for weapons and so forth. And the EU even remarkably has done amazing things, frankly, that nobody would have expected perhaps some years ago. But that said, if you're asking the bigger question of whether Europe can defend itself without the United States, then I think that's much more problematic. There are efforts obviously underway now to bolster European defense industries and all the rest of it. But to do that with credibility is the work of many, many years, maybe a decade, I don't know what. It's not something you do overnight.
So the last numbers of the Kyle Institute that measure this, they say that at the current speed, the production that Russia is making on military equipment surpasses everything in Europe. And they will be able in 6 months, Russia, to replace the entire stock that Germany, which is the most powerful economy of Europe, has. So
Well, that's a reflection
Germany
of
will
that.
take years to have that ability. The Kyle Institute, as you know, is considered extremely credible, and it is quite pessimistic about this. And the question is, do the Europeans really, in spite of the speeches of the politicians or the NATO leaders, do they really perceive or believe that you will be attacked by Russia, excluding countries that are on the borders, such as the Baltics and Poland, that are spending a lot of money on their own defense. But do they really believe in this, the Western European countries? Because they are not acting as if they think that Russia can attack them.
Yeah. I think, well, look, I mean, it's a fundamental question. I think, you know, in two pieces here. I mean, the first that you were mentioning about the Russian war economy, I mean, I think that reality reflects two things. First of all, you know, for Russia, this is an existential conflict. For the regime, it's an existential conflict. They're willing, and Russia, there's plenty of historical precedent for this, to mobilize enormous resources against this effort. And so it's not surprising to me that they're able to do that. You pay a price for that, obviously, but they're able to do it. In Europe, for all kinds of reasons, key countries have underinvested in defense since the end of the Cold War. And it's unclear that there's the political will really to do this at a level that would be so meaningful that you could do without the United States as a security partner in Europe. And why would you want to do that? Well, you know, you might want to do it to hedge against policy change in Washington, but you might also want to do it because you have, you know, this looming challenge with China, which things could go wrong in Asia that would make this so-called pivot to Asia not a long-term thing, but a very rapid thing, which would have huge meaning for Europe when there's a war. Is Europe really, you know, what is the perception of threat? Well, as you say, I mean, if you're in the Baltic states or in Poland, you have a very palpable perception of threat. If you're further away, it obviously has a different character, but you can see even in French policy, for example, it's become much tougher on this, much more forward-leaning. Not so much because France believes it's going to be invaded by Russia, but because they understand that a Russia unleashed is very bad news for French and European interests, maybe existentially. And so, which is a slightly different thing, but no less important. And so, you know, I don't know what the answer is ultimately to that. The problem is it just takes a long time. And there is a more fundamental thing which I think affects a lot of countries in Europe. It's one thing to build defense industries. It's quite another to use force and to have conscription and to have all of these things that Europe thought it got away from. I'm not sure, living in Europe, that societies here are fully prepared to do that. You know,
Concerning the
I'm not sure.
alliance, I mean, the partnership, not alliance, they don't like that classification. The Chinese don't. How do you see it between Russia and China? Is Russia definitely the weaker part? They are just doing and helping the great Chinese strategy against the order, against the American order mainly, the Western order, or that is not so clear?
I think the Russians, you know, when it comes to the relationship with China, time is not on their side, and I think they're in fact rather anxious, even paranoid about Chinese power over the longer term. But at the moment, they're extremely needy for this. They need Chinese technology, they need Chinese money, they need all sorts of things, and they do share this kind of revolutionary, if you want to say, anyway, challenging perspective on the international system. And they share that outlook, perhaps. They have different equities when it comes to the relationship, above all, with the United States, but also with Europe. So they're not exactly aligned, but there is a marriage of convenience there, no question.
There is an extreme caution by some members of NATO about the full accession of Ukraine. Do you think that will go on, will disappear with the end of the conflict? Or it's deeper than that, and some NATO members believe that should be a buffer zone, a neutral country. How do you see that?
I think with the
after,
end
after
of
the war,
the phrase "with the end of the conflict" makes a big difference.
right. How it ends?
Because, well, how it ends, but also that it ends or somehow stabilizes or stops, if not ends, slightly different. You know, because at the moment it's almost impossible for NATO to envision offering membership to Ukraine. because of what that would imply in the midst of a conflict. If there is not a conflict ongoing, but just an extremely tense relationship with Russia, then maybe the debate will be very different, although there will still be countries that have real reservations about that. But NATO operates by consensus, and NATO keeps with the mantra that eventually Ukraine is going to be a member of NATO. They wouldn't say that if countries didn't agree with it, right?
Right.
So, but that's where it is. But I don't see any rapid movement towards that. And maybe it matters more if Ukraine becomes a member of the European Union. That's also not easy to sell in Europe.
Yeah.
If you're a farmer.
Ukraine has
certain
huge
places.
restraints in which concerns to the use of military Western equipment. There are important countries such as the US that do not allow Ukraine to use their weapons against some targets inside the Russian Federation. So there is in here a clear fear of a direct confrontation with Russia. This is clear, right?
Well, I think that's felt in different ways in different places. I think the U.S. because of this, the kind of overwhelming importance, significance of this strategic relationship between the two principal nuclear-armed adversaries, if you like. I mean, this matters a lot, this question of strategic stability, and so I sort of understand the caution about this. I mean, it's possible to go quite far without going further than we think makes sense in terms of this ongoing risk, because it's, let's be honest, the longer the conflict goes on, the greater the accumulated risk of something going wrong. Accidents, incidents that escalate, whatever it may be. And I can imagine any administration being very, very concerned about that. So the other question you have to ask yourself, a question for military planners, is would this be transforming? I mean, if you allowed Ukraine to use weapons that are capable of striking deep into Russia to do it, would that change their prospects? I don't know the answer to that. It would help, but would it be transforming?
That's an important question.
Maybe not.
So everybody's waiting for the American elections. In the Middle East, in Russia, in China, and of course, in Europe. That's the main factor.
Americans are waiting too.
All right.
This outcome.
Okay. So it is still the indispensable state and nation. Right?
I would put it that
On
way.
foreign affairs, yes.
That's true.
So I believe that now it's time for the questions of the audience. I don't. I think somebody will go there with a mic, of course. Maybe more than one.
It's coming.
I don't have.
Sorry, this doesn't seem to work, but I'll try my voice.
I think it is working.
Rapidly dwindling.
It works.
We're talking about year of decision, but don't we run the risk of being overrun by the unexpected? We do have a pretty hot conflict, which is changing in nature in Ukraine, another one that is changing in the Middle East, and a transatlantic partner who is directly involved with Hezbollah and with Hamas, which is Turkey, which happens to have the largest army in NATO. And so there are several unponderables that are coming, including the fact that something will go out of hand in these next days or in the transition period between the two administrations. What do you expect? What is your best guess as to what could happen?
Sorry.
I heard.
I won't ask a long question.
It was clear. It's hard to say. I mean, you mentioned a lot of, challenging issues for any administration. I mean, what could happen between now and November? Well, you could have things happen on any of those fronts, plus some that you didn't mention, in the South China Sea or Taiwan, I think less likely, but things not by design, but simply by accident that could happen. And we're not even talking here about financial risks and other things that can also happen. So that that's a big variable. I mean, you have this confluence of both big kind of structural challenges that have to do with power and the system and all the rest of it, and you also have these flashpoints. But that's just the nature of what any administration is going to face. I can't predict, honestly.
How likely will there be cooperation between the two parties if something happens in this interim period, which also stretches until January? That's my question.
Depends what it is. I mean, I think under certain conditions you can absolutely imagine a kind of bipartisan response, especially to do with China, where my sense is, I mean, I sit in Brussels, but my sense is that there's probably more consensus, bipartisan consensus around China, broadly speaking, than there is on a lot of other things. And so if we were to get ourselves into some sort of a clash with China, or something happens with the Philippines and China that we're compelled to react to, you can imagine a lot of different things. I think there would be, any administration would be dealing with a more consensual kind of difficult, really challenging, but not necessarily politically fraught in the same way. Have to see. I mean, that's just, I think they worry more about the stock market at this point.
So,
hi there. Hello. Just for the record, I do not support Donald Trump, but is there any upside whatsoever if he becomes the president?
That's an interesting.
No, because it's a
I mean,
second term.
well, half the country would give you a very clear answer to that, actually.
I'm asking your opinion.
My opinion, look, personally, I'm not a supporter either, as you might have gathered. But let me say, I mean, sometimes, someone who's a real challenger to the orthodoxy shakes things up in ways that actually have some benefit and stick. I mean, you can give an example of this in the foreign policy area. People often talk about the Abraham Accords in the Middle East, which the Biden administration is stuck with, in various dimensions. That was not a bad thing. And so you could imagine that. I don't see. Personally, I just don't think would be a very good development. What I would really worry about, if you'll allow me, is to make the point that we're talking about this in binary terms. I mean, we have one outcome or we have another. But in fact, there are other things that sitting in Europe you should be concerned about, or indeed sitting in the United States you should be concerned about. But this notion of a chaotic, dysfunctional governance in the United States, where it's difficult to pass legislation, difficult to get people confirmed, difficult to engage with the United States on big issues, whether it's climate or security or other things. This is not to say, what could happen if you actually had a challenged election outcome. I mean, these are real concerns to me, whether Harris wins or Trump wins. It's a third problem.
Thank you. So,
Yeah. Amanda, we'll get to you. We really will. Sure.
the microphone up there?
Oh, okay.
Hi, thanks, Ian. I wanted to flip the frame, and as an American in Brussels, get your sense of whether Europe is ready for a second Trump administration. You were in Brussels when Trump was elected the first time. It was a surprise to many in 2016, and I think Trump is now not going to be a surprise. We know what he stands for. There's been a bit of discussion about NATO, about Ukraine. My own sense is it's not clear that Europe is necessarily better positioned now than they were 8 years ago, but I'm interested in what you're seeing, if you have a sense that there's contingency planning happening in capitals, and how European leaders are preparing for and likely to respond to a Trump presidency if that occurs.
Amanda, thank you very much. I mean, it's a good question. I would agree with the premise that there's a very different, in a sense, a different feel to this than the last time around, because this experiment has sort of been run already, and they know what they're trying to hedge against. There are contingency there is contingency planning. I mean, it's kind of sectoral. I mean, where you see it most, I think, is in the trade area, where clearly within the Commission and elsewhere, there's a lot of thinking about, well, what do we do if Trump comes in and he does what he threatens to do on tariffs or in other regulatory areas. There are people in the sort of climate and energy sphere who are thinking about, all right, what do we do? And there are some things that you can do that have to do with cities and states in the United States and other kinds of things. On the NATO side, there's concern, but also, perhaps a sense of what I was trying to describe, which is that there really are limits to how disruptive that could be. Then there's the bigger picture thing about, what does Europe do in terms of its own autonomy, strategic autonomy in various sectors. There's no question that this gives a boost to those who want to see that, but it also tends to come back to this question of, that those things that they could do that are hedges, really Europe should be doing anyway. Because even if Harris is elected, if you're thinking about the American commitment to European security, what happens if you have a crisis in the South China Sea next week? There are consequences for European security and our presence in Europe that you would have to contend with whatever the administration is. So that, over the longer, and then there's a whole debate about European economic competitiveness, for example, which would, the Draghi report probably would look the same no matter who is, it will look the same no matter who is elected. So I think there is this sense, the difference is the last time around there was a lot of kind of, how do we deal with this individual? What's the secret here to dealing with him in that way? And there wasn't any really good answer to that in the end. But I think, again, it's an important question, and part of the answer is that Europe has to contend with more than just the outcome of the election. They have to contend with a more chaotic political and social scene in the United States, with different kinds of financial risks that emanate from the United States, all kinds of things that aren't necessarily driven entirely by the election outcome. How do you deal with that? So yes, I think there is a lot of thinking about that. I don't think they have a lot of good answers, to be honest, and there is a little bit of a sense of almost powerlessness, if I can say, and wishful thinking, maybe, about this.
And is not unpopular all over Europe, Donald Trump.
No, there are places, clearly, where ideologically they would be more comfortable with it.
Well, I'm not a masochist, so I'm not going to worry about what if Trump wins. Actually, what concerns elections, he has already said that there will be no need for more elections. So, assuming that Harris will win, do you think that she will have the guts to really look at and push for a change in the dysfunctional electoral system of the US? Will that depend on the results on the elections for Congress? Other question, again, regarding the future Harris administration. Considering what she is experiencing and the world is experiencing with fake news, disinformation, and so on, the role of the digital platforms and without any regulation, even more now with the impact of AI, will she move towards regulating and breaking these big platforms, the Elon Musks, the Peter Thils of this world? Will she work with Europe in that sense?
Yeah. Well, look, I think on the regulatory side. Well, first of all, on the electoral college and that system. I mean, that discussion in the United States is a little bit like UN Security Council reform. Good luck with that. And it does, of course, depend on the political equation at the congressional level as well. But it's a really tough one. There's a lot of kind of vested history and everything else there that operates at the local level as well as the federal level. I wouldn't bet on anybody spending a lot of political capital on trying to change the electoral college. nice as that might be, I just think it's most unlikely. On the regulatory side, I mean, that's interesting. I mean, I do think, yeah, I mean, all things being equal, a Harris administration would be more interested in some sense, emulating a bit of what is happening in Brussels, which is affecting above all American companies, actually, you know, the so-called Brussels effect and so on. And, you know, there are delegations coming from the US Congress all the time to Brussels to try to understand what the AI Act and other things, what this actually is. And I do think there is some potential over time for the United States to start adopting more kind of cautionary approaches to regulation in that area. You know, will we ever have exactly the same approach? Probably not. But the asymmetry comes from the complete dominance of American multinationals in this space. But one thing about that is interesting, and it's very noticeable if you sit in Brussels, is, you know, the extent to which American companies, you know, are really present and concerned and engaged in these debates in Brussels. And it does have an effect on behavior, and you see differences from company to company. They're not all on the same page when it comes to, they behave very differently, you know, actually. Some of them are much more statesmanlike, if I can say, than others when it comes to this. And so, you know, Brussels has really become the place for, you know, for this. There's a sense that what Brussels does will eventually somehow be adopted elsewhere. And, you know, maybe that's an element of a stronger transatlantic relationship at the end of the day, despite this asymmetry.
One very important event's going to take place 1 week from today, which are proposed to Transatlantic, and that is the ILA port strike. So the entire U.S. East Coast, U.S. Gulf Coast will be on strike 1 week from today at midnight. The International Longshoremen's Association, shutting down trade from Europe and Asia to the U.S. East Coast, Gulf, whatever can ship via ocean is going to go West Coast, and that's going to be over capacity. Do you think Biden's going to pull the Taft-Hartley Act and intervene? He's already said he won't, and if he doesn't, what effect could that have on the election? Thank you.
Yeah, that is a really interesting question. My short answer to that is I have no idea what he's going to do. But it's usually important, right? And you can see what the political dilemma would be here, right? I mean, because on the other hand, they don't want to look like they're, you know, sort of union busting, as it were. On the other hand, you know, there are a lot of other industries, a lot of other employees and businesses who are affected by that. You know, what is the political equation there? Well, if I were to ask in this season, I would look at it maybe through the lens of some of these key swing states and their manufacturing industries, and what is at stake in that context, you know, which would perhaps argue for some kind of intervention. But here I'm guessing. I suspect you're following it much more closely than I am. But still, it's usually important, and it just also shows you how tenuous some of this connectivity can be in a, you know, given this kind of thing. The same thing happened on the West Coast some years ago, right? Which was disruptive enough. People have that experience in mind.
So this gentleman in the first row.
Thank you, Mr. Lesser. It's interesting to me. You've described the unpredictability of what Trump might do in so many areas. But in fact, there's a parallel. You see, we don't know what Trump's going to do because he's unpredictable, but we don't know what Harris is going to do because she hadn't said it in the foreign policy area. And it is a new area. She, obviously, for her, I mean, I think to me, it's absolutely clear Biden is the last Eurocentric president the U.S. will have. I don't know whether you would agree with that statement, but I feel pretty strongly that I think we're fooling ourselves if we think U.S. presidents will continue to be Eurocentric. So, given the fact that she has said so little, other than to say, of course, I'll follow, but she has to, for political reasons, take a position of saying, I will follow what has happened before. Can you tell us what areas in Brussels and in your own thinking her California personal history is likely to to lead to more significant changes than anybody's talking about today.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I mean, it's an important question. I think a lot of this is frankly just structural. I mean, some of it perhaps depends on personal outlook and formation and her experience, but it's not as if she hasn't been around foreign policy issues and intelligence issues and things like this. I mean, it's impossible to avoid. I mean, and you know, in this realm, advisors matter too. And her chief foreign security policy advisor is as Atlanticist as you're going to get, actually. And so, you know, and speaks multiple European languages, and he's sort of John Kerry and a half in this respect. And so, I think I wouldn't take for granted the fact that because you know much of her career was spent in she's from California, and she's not necessarily a foreign policy maven, that somehow she'll be looking elsewhere. But there is something structural there. You know, the United States is a bi-oceanic country. You know, before the railroads knit the country together and before the Panama Canal, perhaps you could treat these as separate spheres, but in fact, that was a long time ago. You could say the U.S. is coming to the end of a 100-year pivot to Europe after the First World War in security terms. There's something deeply structural here. It is the largest economic relationship in the world between the United States and Europe. There's a war in Europe. You know, NATO is what it is. You don't just dismantle all of that. I mean, clearly there are things that could happen in the Indo-Pacific that would draw American attention away. And and clearly if you go out far enough, the sort of growing geoeconomic weight of Asia makes itself felt. But I don't see anyone turning American policy around. I mean, it's already a balancing act. You know, it has been for a very long time. And, you know, by different measures. I mean, even during the Second World War, there were these big debates about, you know, Europe first, the Pacific first, all this kind of thing. There's still a lot binding the United States to Europe in policy terms, not just human terms, commercial terms. I think it's not so much a question of geographic shift, it's a question of foreign policy style and how we engage with allies anywhere. You know, and if you allow me just one more comment on this, I think, you know, one of the things that I would be very concerned about, frankly, it's a trend for, given whatever political changes there may be, is this very bad fit between increasing economic nationalism,
Right.
protectionism, say, and the desire for closer alliance cohesion. This is true in Europe, it's true in Asia. I mean, if Nippon Steel can't buy U.S. steel, at a time when we're trying to reinforce the relationship with Japan vis-a-vis China, this is not a good fit. If you're putting all of these tariffs on European aluminum and steel and other things, and you want Europe to do more and spend more on defense, this is not a good fit. That's going to be a challenge for any administration because the domestic pressures are to take it in that direction. And by the way, there are pressures for that in Europe too, obviously. I think that's a huge, huge challenge.
Any more questions?
Thank you, Dr. Lesser. Thank you very much for all the information you brought us today here. I am an international relations PhD student at Nova University of Lisbon. And I would like to know, you mentioned that Donald Trump may not, if he wins, of course, may not exit NATO, but give them a hard time. But we have to remind that he has a close partnership, relation to Mr. Putin. And I don't know if he wants to engage in this war. But if the war escalates, there is still the 5th article of NATO Charter. So how do you know this is going to end? If he has to take a part, which part?
I don't know his history, his approach to Putin, all the rest of it. Clearly, he doesn't share the automatic discomfort that many of us have in thinking about Putin. On the other hand, under these conditions at the moment, that's some liability to be too close to this guy. I think even for Trump. I think what really dominates his thinking about this is not so much a kind of friendship with Putin or a kind of being a Russophile or something. It's not that. It's his belief that somehow he can, just with the force of his personality and cleverness, can force a solution to a conflict and change a relationship based on that. You saw this with North Korea. You've seen it in other things that he did. I mean, good luck if he can do that. I think it's pretty tough, to be honest. And he's just as likely to react very strongly and badly to a Putin that resists this as anything else. Maybe. It's all kind of speculation. I just don't really know. On Article 5, I mean, look, there is nothing. There's somebody in the room who knows much more about this than I do. But Article 5 is not automatic. NATO, everything is done by consensus, from buying paper clips to nuclear strategy to the choice of a new Secretary General. Everything is done by consensus. That's a strength, obviously.
Right, Article 5.
It's a
You
strength.
do not have to send
but
military
you'll
force.
remember the
You
one
can
time
send
it was applied after September 11th. The Allies decided to do this, and arguably, if the Secretary General at the time, Lord Robertson, hadn't pressed this and kind of mobilized this, it might not have happened. Actually, so. And it comes up with other countries that are sometimes a bit prickly and sovereignty conscious inside the alliance. Turkey, for example, is not the easiest. Is there any automaticity if Russia and Turkey were to get themselves in trouble, which they can, by the way, very easily, has happened, could happen again? There'll be a debate. And I think this is a factor in Turkey's. Yes, difficult inside the alliance, but there are limits, as you saw with their agreement at the end of the day on Finland. They have to look over their shoulder at that problem too. So, again, it's in America's interest to have that connection, to have that relationship. But it's not automatic. It requires maintenance, and it requires political goodwill of your alliance partners. Put it in effect.
All right, I would like to thank you so much for being here, and especially to Dr. Lesser, who could be here all night long talking, right? Indeed. But he has to go, right? So thank you so much.
Thank you. Good to see you. What did you do? Oh, okay. Good. Nice